Hello 8883703 and welcome to video 2 of this lecture 9 on military spending. This is a video I wanted to introduce to you. It's only 3 minutes. Have a look at it later on when you're checking out this video generally. About the rise and fall of the great powers, Paul Kennedy's book. He looked at the great powers from about 1500 to 2000 and looked at why they rose and why they fell. And a key point, or essentially what he said, was that power does not depend on geography and politics as one might think, but actually on economics. And that's why it's a key point for us, specifically in this lecture of this unit. But have a look if you want to. Now we must look at other considerations, like the configuration of a state's military forces, for example. This also presents choices in terms of spending. The configuration, of course, depends on the type of mission the state's embarking upon, because different missions require different forces. So during the Cold War, for example, about half of all military spending in the US budget, and indeed the world, basically, was directed towards East-West conflict in Europe. But after the Cold War, other missions such as interventions in regional conflicts are obviously more important, along with new missions for military forces, including humanitarian assistance, drug interdiction, aid to other nations in building roads and schools and other infrastructural situations. So during the Cold War, the primary mission of US armed forces then was to contain the Soviet Union, especially from attacking Western Europe, but also at the same time keeping an eye on the Middle East and Southeast Asia. But then comes the Gulf War in 1991 with a new type of mission suggested based on the ability to deploy a large armed force to a regional conflict area. Now, after the Cold War, US policymakers envisioned this idea of smaller groups of conventional troops combined with special operation forces stationed around the world, armed with advanced weapons which could be deployed very quickly in the event of a threat. But the 2003 Iraq War, if anyone knows their history, showed that technology and special forces alone could not pacify a large country with basically a hostile population. And so US military rethinking continues. It refined its strategies in wars such as Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, countries where vibrant illegal arms supply insurgents with basically everything that they want. And then, of course, another important point is with regards to the Global South, where military spending also varies greatly across countries, depending in part, really, on the government in power. So, for example, whether it's a military government or a civilian government. So the type of government also determines the amount of military spending in the majority of cases. And also, a very important point, spending depends heavily on available hard currency, from exports of oil or other products to actually pay for arms purchases. Now we'll focus our discussion on the international arms trade. Now, obviously, the international arms trade is an especially important industry in international trade generally. It operates largely outside of the framework of normal commercial transactions, though, because obviously of its national security implications. So the arms trade, as we know it, has quite a life of its own, actually. It starts off by governments of industrialized nations wanting to protect their domestic arms industries rather than, relying on imports to meet their weapons needs. And these domestic arms industries become stronger and more economically viable by exporting their products as well as supplying their own governments with these products. And a very good example of this is Arms Corps during the apartheid years. You guys looked into this a bit during tutorials, a while ago. So Arms Corps started producing all sorts of weapons out of necessity because you remember the arms embargo against South Africa at the time during apartheid. But through a combination of smuggling and indigenously developed weapons, it wasn't long before Arms Corps grew to the world, the world's third biggest arms producer at the time. And in addition to that, some systems that were developed here in South Africa were regarded as being amongst the world's best, like the Rooivalk attack helicopter and the 155mm G5 and G6 self-propelled guns. And obviously not to even speak about the 6.5 nuclear bombs that we had developed as well. So it was also not long before South Africa started exporting many of these systems, really pumping a significant income into South African GDP, while at the same time providing high-tech equipment for South Africa's border war in Angola, interestingly. But now to get back, governments usually participate actively in the military-industrial sector of the economy, even in countries like the US. For example, like fighter jets are a product in which the US enjoys a global comparative advantage, right? But in the 1990s, the demand at home started to decline, and so the US started looking overseas for new customers, something that it's always done, but now on a much larger scale. So by 2006, for example, US arms sales totaled nearly $17 billion, which was obviously a really nice injection into its economy. Right, so arms trade, of course, implies exports and imports because that's what trade is, okay? So when we look at arms imports in For example, in the global south, we see that arms imports make up more than half of all arms sales. And in recent decades, about half of the South's arms imports have been in the Middle East, although lately India and China have taken a growing share. Arms imports, if you basically about 29% come from the United States, followed by Russia, and those together make up about half of all international arms sales. But let's have a quick look to the next slide, and then we'll come back. Just a reminder slide that I showed you before. The 5 largest arms suppliers from 2013 to 2017, according to SIPRI, were the US, Russia, France, Germany, and China, accounting for 74% of the total global volume of exports of major weapons in that period of time. Okay, but let's go back then. Globally, arms sales have declined in the post-Cold War era, all right? Attention has specifically been called to the sales of small arms, especially assault rifles, to unstable conflict zones where irregular armies commit brutalities. This is the point we were making a few weeks ago when we discussed small arms and light weapons and the whole illicit industry. This is particularly a big problem, especially in the industry of illicit trade or smuggling, which will be our next discussion. So here's our discussion on the illicit international arms trade. The problem, well, there's many problems actually, but the key problem here is that in the illicit arms trade is that no matter what restrictions governments may place on trading certain goods, someone, unfortunately, is always willing to risk punishment to make a profit through such trade. I mean, let's revisit the Lord of War to understand that. Both legal goods imported illegally or illegal goods are often sold in black markets or sometimes in secret markets. Now, what's the difference between them? Right, a black market is a market in goods or services which operate outside the formal ones, the formal markets that is, supported by an established state power, and it's sort of usually illegal. That's illegal markets. A secret market, though, is a market in goods or services within a formal government-supported program, right, where the details are kept secret for political reasons. For example, CIA arms sales to the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in the 1980s, to fight the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or more recently to countries like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia in return for their support in the war against terror. Black markets are particularly widespread and flourish in economies that are heavily regulated by governments, such as centrally planned economies. Black markets are also a substantial, though hard to measure, fraction of the total economic activity in many developing countries and in transitional economies like Russia, and they deprive the government of significant revenue, obviously. The extent of illicit trade varies from country to country and obviously industry to industry, depending on profitability and enforcement. Weapons and drugs are by far the most profitable, and extensive illegal networks exist for both of these in terms of trade, and they're often intertwined with schemes like drugs in exchange for weapons or vice versa. International black markets for weapons trade are notorious. Arguably the most notorious so far has been the nuclear smuggling ring of A.Q. Khan, developer of Pakistan's nuclear bomb, which is our case study for today, which we'll see later on. But basically, what it boils down to is that any state or non-state actor with enough money can buy most kinds of weapons, albeit at premium prices, of course. Different state actors have different interests in enforcing political control over the illicit arms trade. What is a given is that the exporting state may gain economically from the trade, and the importing state gains access to the weapons. The losers are the other exporters that neither got the export revenue nor kept the weapons out of the hands of the importer. So, illicit trade often creates conflicts of interests among states and leads to complex political bargaining amongst governments, each obviously looking out for its own interests. So it's important to remember that various importers of illicit arms have their own different agendas. So as you'll see from today's video clip on the Pakistan situation, Pakistan not only wanted a nuclear bomb because they felt threatened by their arch enemy India's nuclear capability, but they also wanted a nuclear capability for the entire Islamic world. So in the words of the Pakistani President Bhutto at the time, said, the Hindus have a bomb, the Christians have a bomb, the Jews have a bomb, and the only civilization who does not have a bomb is Islam. So this ideal will set the stage for the worst illicit nuclear scandal the world has ever seen. Through a vast smuggling network, Pakistan successfully developed its own atomic bomb and then illicitly exported that knowledge and technology to whoever was willing to pay premium money for it. Now I'm going to show you guys a video on it's actually Abdul Qadir Khan, but known sort of more formally as A.Q. Khan, basically a Pakistani nuclear physicist and a metallurgical engineer. Now have a look at this video.
Khan was a brilliant engineer, metallurgical engineer, who trained in Europe, in Germany and Belgium. And he was highly regarded by his thesis supervisor and highly recommended. So he got a job with Urenco, which is the British, Dutch, and I think one other country consortium for working on centrifuges and enriched uranium technology. So he was working there initially as a translator, but he gained the respect, the trust of the people there, and he was given bigger responsibilities. He gained access to the drawings of the centrifuges of the Urenco, which was a leading organization in that field. And he also got access to the list of suppliers for Urenco, the European suppliers, the Swiss, the Italians, the Germans, and all this. So he was a nationalist, a Pakistani nationalist. And in 1972, Bhutto had declared that Pakistan should also have an Islamic bomb.
A.Q. Khan was a brilliant engineer, metallurgical engineer, who trained in Europe, in Germany and Belgium. And he was highly regarded by his thesis supervisor and highly recommended. So he got a job with Urenco, which is the British, Dutch, and I think one other country consortium for working on centrifuges and enriched uranium technology. So he was working there initially as a translator, but he gained the respect, the trust of the people there, and he was given bigger responsibilities. He gained access to the drawings of the centrifuges of the Urenco, which was a leading organization in that field. And he also got access to the list of suppliers for Urenco, the European suppliers, the Swiss, the Italians, the Germans, and all this. So he was a nationalist, a Pakistani nationalist. And in 1972, Bhutto had declared that Pakistan should also have an Islamic bomb. And he asked Munir Ahmed Khan, who was the head of the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission, an ex-IAEA man. The IAEA connection is there in the sideline, to develop a plutonium bomb. But after the Indian test 1974, A.Q. Khan, now it's unclear here whether he approached the Pakistani government or whether the Pakistani government approached him. The long and short is, he was asked by the Pakistan government to undertake work on enriched uranium.
Well, the A.Q. Khan network was really a remarkable breakdown of the non-proliferation system. What you had was a really global network operating from more than a dozen countries over the course of more than 2 decades. It started off as an import network supplying Pakistan's nuclear program, but then got turned around into an export network that was supplying countries all over the world. So they were supplying centrifuge technology, which countries can use to enrich uranium to the level required for nuclear weapons. It's really the technology of choice for the determined nuclear cheater because it's small and easy to hide. And they were exporting that to North Korea, to Iran, to Libya, at least. There's almost certainly a fourth customer. They talked in their internal communications about the fourth customer. We haven't yet identified exactly who the fourth customer was. They also attempted to export to Iraq when it was still ruled by Saddam Hussein. Fortunately, the first Gulf War in 1991 cut short Iraq's nuclear weapons program before Iraq had the opportunity to take the advantage of the offer. from the Khan network. But they were also exporting actual nuclear weapon designs, at least to Libya, and we strongly suspect to other countries as well. They provided, for example, to Iran a package of information about how to take uranium metal and cast it into the kind of spheres you would want for the core of a nuclear bomb.
So the chain went from North Korea through China to Pakistan and to Iran and Libya, with suppliers in Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and other places. Some subcontract work being done in Malaysia or Southeast Asian countries. And it was a very successful operation. I mean, A.Q. Khan claimed, or the Pakistani military government claimed that this was a rogue operation, but I don't believe that. Because the aircraft which would be used to fly, to ferret the supplies from North Korea and elsewhere, were Pakistan government aircraft.
What was new in a way about the A.Q. Khan network was this sort of global network of private entrepreneurs integrated by a participant in a state network, namely A.Q. Khan, that was sort of reaching out to potential proliferants and saying, look what we have to offer, rather than a state putting together a procurement network saying this is what we need and going out and figuring out ways to get it.
This story had started in '79, and the agencies in the U.S. government had interfered with the arrest of A.Q. Khan and had tolerated, not accepted, but tolerated the weapons development by Pakistan's military government in the 80s because of other considerations on the American side. So I was not surprised at all. I mean, I was surprised at when the revelations came out, New York Times and others, and there's a lot of material on this, that about the extensive scale of the network.
Well, I think what the Khan network revealed that was very distressing was first that there were sources of this technology who could be corrupted to sell it to practically anyone, not just in Pakistan, but in Switzerland and Germany and South Africa and the United States and a variety of countries all over the world, really, where participants were participating in this. Secondly, it revealed that export controls were nowhere near as strong as they needed to be. A lot of this activity was either not noticed or it was actually legal in the countries where it was taking place because their laws were so weak. Thirdly, I think it indicated that our intelligence capabilities, and in particular our cooperation in intelligence between different countries, was nowhere near as strong as it needed to be because it took decades to figure out this network and to take it down ultimately. And I think fourthly, it showed that the world's law enforcement response is nowhere near what it needs to be. Almost all of the participants in the A.Q. Khan network are free men today, and they're largely rich free men today. And that's not a good example to send to future potential participants in these kinds of black market networks. I think the IAEA still has a ways to go in its work on nuclear smuggling. What they do now is they receive information provided by member states and put it together into a database, the International Trafficking Database.
Okay, that's it for this lecture 9 on military spending. It's important for the exams, everyone, so please make sure you look at both videos 1 and 2.